So, I'd like to talk to you about sex work from the position of being a feminist and a sex workers' rights advocate. It's often referred to as the oldest profession, and sex work is probably one of the most contentious and controversial professions that a person can choose. It's really heavily stigmatized. Nearly everybody has some strong moral opinion about it. It divides the feminist community, and there's tons of misinformation about it out there. So when I say sex work, I'm talking about the whole sex industry. Prostitution is the most controversial type of sex work, and with the one with the most legal issues around it. And when I talk about legal issues today, I'll be mostly discussing ones around prostitution. But sex work also includes things like exotic dancing, phone sex, pornography, erotic massage, peep shows, fetish modeling, professional dominatrix work, and so forth. So first I'd like to talk about the perception of those involved in the sex industry, both the workers and the consumers. There's some pretty persistent and inaccurate and conflicting too stereotypes around both of these groups. Can everybody hear me, and am I speaking at an okay pace? Okay, cool. So there's two sex worker images that really persist in the cultural consciousness, and that's of the street prostitute and then the high-class call girl. Sex workers are often stereotyped as women who are drug addicts, alcoholics, people lacking moral fiber, disease carriers, uneducated, lacking in intelligence, class, and ambition, or irresponsible, or people who are victims and unwilling participants in the sex industry. So each of these traits is true for some sex workers, but they don't apply as a whole. And I'll note when I talk about statistics, because of the nature of the work, it's really difficult to find accurate statistics. There's lots of studies and lots of data points, but a lot of it either comes from police statistics or via self-reporting. So take any information I give you with a grain of salt, but this is the best that can be done in the current climate we live in. Okay, so first of all, the majority of sex workers are cis women. There's a significant number of cis men involved in sex work, and for those unfamiliar, cis basically means not trans, so people who identify as the gender they were assigned at birth. And transgender, there are lots of transgender people in sex work. They tend to be disproportionately represented in the sex industry due to the social stigma and discrimination that trans people face in other areas of their lives. The most visible segment of sex workers are probably street prostitutes, but only an estimated 20% of prostitutes are actually street workers. The rest work through agencies, massage parlors, body houses, or work independently, posting ads on Craigslist or running their own website. Sex workers are often seen as disease carriers, but many sex workers are really well educated about STI transmission, and they're very invested in protecting their own health and the health of their clients. I mean, that's their business, right? The U.S. Department of Health consistently reports that only 3 to 5% of sexually transmitted diseases in the U.S. are related to prostitution, compared to 30 to 35% related to teenagers. The CDC also cites no proven cases of HIV transmission from prostitutes to clients. While lack of education and opportunity is a factor for some people entering the sex trade, a 2009 study by economists Scott Cunningham and Todd Kendall report that 40% of prostitutes have a college degree and 80% have completed some college. We can contrast this to Canadian society as a whole, where 47% of people have a college degree, and American society, where 39% of Americans hold college degree. Prostitution is also often associated with a lack of self-esteem or regard for oneself. But a 1986 study by Diane Prince found that call girls and brothel workers had higher self-esteem than before they became prostitutes. In her study, 97% of call girls said they liked themselves more than before. Alcohol and drug addiction varies widely. Studies have found that it's relatively common among street prostitutes, but relatively rare among sex workers who work indoors. Motivations for entering the sex industry are diverse. Some people engage in it reluctantly as a survival tactic because of economic desperation or lack of other opportunity. Some people are tragically coerced or trafficked into prostitution. Meanwhile, many others get into sex work for more positive or empowering reasons, such as paying for school because they want to have a job that's more fulfilling and allows them to have more human dignity. Or because they simply enjoy the work, the money, the freedom that self-employment can provide, and because they enjoy working with their clients. Most sex workers negotiate clear boundaries about what acts they're comfortable with, work with a very small number of regular clients, and carefully select clients that they're comfortable with. People who patronize sex workers, particularly prostitutes, are often believed to be misogynistic, lacking in empathy, immoral, unattractive, desperate or arrogant, all kinds of negative traits. And again, while these characteristics can be applied to individuals, they're really not representative of sex buyers as a whole. An international study of 700 Johns found that the men generally had good social skills. They had average or above average education. They spanned a wide range of age groups and ethnic backgrounds, and over half were married or in relationships with women. And men are not the only people who purchase sex. While it's less common, women and couples do use the services of prostitutes and other sex workers. So there's a great deal of misunderstanding about the legal status of sex work in Canada. Primarily that selling sex is illegal. Most people are surprised to learn that this is not actually true. It's actually completely legal in Canada. However, while the exchange of money for sex is not illegal, sections 210, 212, and 213 of the Criminal Code prohibit living off the avails of prostitution, running a common body house, or communicating for the purposes of prostitution. So while these laws were put in place ostensibly to protect women and improve neighborhoods, they really do result in sex workers being unable to hire bodyguards, being unable to effectively screen clients, and being forced to work on the street. Professional dominatrix Terry Jean Bradford and former prostitutes Valerie Scott and Amy Lebovich with the Sex Professionals of Canada recently launched a constitutional challenge against these sections of the Criminal Code. In September of 2010, Susan Justice Himmel of the Ontario Superior Court struck down those sections on the basis that they unnecessarily endanger sex workers. So the federal and Ontario governments are currently in the process of appealing Himmel's decision, and there's a stay in effect pending the verdict. And I believe that will be coming in later this year or early next year. So those who are in favor of prostitution being legal tend to fall into two camps. There's the Legalization Camp and the Decriminalization Camp. And I'm going to quote from FIRST, which is a feminist group that advocates for the rights of sex workers. Legalization involves the creation of specific laws to regulate an activity. Red light districts, zones of tolerance, and licensing options are examples of legalization. Decriminalization refers to the removal of all criminal sanctions for participation in the adult consensual sex industry. Legalization poses its own set of issues that mirror those of criminalization. By regulating the sex industry, those who are the most vulnerable and who need the most protection tend to continue to be marginalized and forced into working in unsafe working conditions. Sex workers who do not comply with regulations would still receive penalties or criminal sanctions, and legalization effectively puts the government into a pimp-like role. Decriminalization would provide sex workers with the same rights and protections provided to other types of workers under each province's human rights and employment standards legislation. Sex workers would be treated the same as other small business owners or independent contractors or employees, just depending on how they are set up, and they would be free to hire employees, rent workspace, file complaints against abusive employers, and they would pay taxes like every other working person does. In 1949, the United Nations adopted a resolution in favor of the decriminalization of prostitution for individual prostitutes, and that has been ratified by 50 countries. In 1973, the National Organization for Women passed a resolution supporting the decriminalization of prostitution. So, sorry, do you have a hand up?
No, I was playing with my hair.
Oh, it's lovely hair. So sex work as it exists now can be a very dangerous profession. Because of the existing laws and social stigma against sex workers, they're often placed in opposition to police, and so they're unable to ensure workplace safety, unable to advocate for their own rights as workers, and they're unable to rely on police to protect them if they are assaulted, robbed, or otherwise victimized by their clients, coworkers, or employers. Decriminalization would go really far to remove these barriers. When we're discussing sex work, the Swedish model is often cited. In 1999, the Swedish government criminalized the purchase of sexual services while keeping the sale of sex decriminalized. So while this law is meant to protect sex workers and only target buyers, it still serves to marginalize sex workers, and it has been heavily criticized by those in the sex industry. This form of prohibition still serves to drive sex work underground, where workers' safety and rights cannot be effectively protected. And Sweden has seen an increase in pimping since the implementation of this law. There's also been an increase in sex tourism to Denmark, which is a nearby country where prostitution is decriminalized. And judicially, it's also just really problematic to make it illegal to buy something that is totally legal to sell. In contrast, we have the model of decriminalization in New Zealand, which has some of the world's most liberal prostitution laws. In 2003, New Zealand's Massage Parlours Act 1978, which limited legal prostitution to certain indoor venues and required workers to register with the police, was replaced by the Prostitution Reform Act 2003. Brothels, escort agencies, and soliciting were decriminalized, and though coercing somebody to provide sexual services still remains illegal. Sex work is recognized as a legitimate line of work by Work and Income New Zealand. Contracts between providers and clients are legally recognized, and providers have the right of refusal. Workplace safety and health rules apply to sex work, and labor disputes can be referred to the Labor Inspectorate and Mediation Service. In 2006, an evaluation was released which showed that the number of street-based sex workers had slightly decreased, and a final report in 2008 concluded that there was no expansion of the industry. All arguments in favor of decriminalizing sex work apply to sex work performed by consenting adults only. Advocates of decriminalization and sex worker rights consistently oppose child sexual abuse and human trafficking, and support exit strategies for those who wish to leave the sex industry, and providing other options to those who may be reluctantly considering engaging in survival sex work. The pro-sex work position is not about a naive belief that all sex work is positive or empowering, because it's not. There is a real problem in the sex industry with trafficking, abuse, and coercion. But as we've seen with sex work, alcohol, marijuana, and all other kinds of things that we've prohibited, prohibition only serves to drive these economies underground, which leads to the proliferation of organized crime and violence, and ends up marginalizing the most vulnerable people in society. So decriminalization is also an effective harm reduction strategy. In addition, while trafficking is a serious and real issue in the sex industry and deserves to be taken seriously, it's also a major problem in other industries such as domestic work, the carpet and garment manufacturing industries, agriculture, and the entertainment industry. And nobody's advocating for the elimination or criminalization of these industries as a way of protecting workers. Trafficking also happens for the purposes of legal adoption and forced marriage, and we're not criminalizing all adoption and marriage. That would not be a solution. So for the victims of trafficking, it behooves us to be conscious and ethical consumers, and to support organizations that provide support and services for victims of these horrible, horrible atrocities. There's also no denying that there is a great deal of sexism and harmful gender dynamics present in the sex industry, such as the objectification of women and the socioeconomic gender imbalance. But these issues aren't going to be resolved through prohibition, and they're really reflected in society as a whole. So as our culture moves towards being more truly egalitarian and systemic sexism becomes eradicated, I believe these social changes are going to be reflected in the microcosm that is the sex industry. Decriminalization of sex work is also a matter of consent and agency. Should we or should we not have the right to choose to engage in consensual sexual acts? And if we can engage in these sexual acts for pleasure, then why not for money? Some anti-sex work advocates argue that women's sexual consent cannot truly exist in our patriarchal society, but this argument against sex work renders sex workers who are not female as invisible and irrelevant, and also places women permanently in the position of being victims. So yeah, sex work exists in the context of a sexist society, but infantilizing women and denying that they have agency isn't going to fix sexism. So whether you agree with me or not on this controversial issue, I hope that this has been an informative and educational look at the myths and realities around sex work, and that you'll take the opportunity to think critically about any assumptions that you may have had. Thank you. Questions? Yes?
Recently, the Toronto Sun published a wonderful article touting their local strippers as being the most intellectual in Canada due to a recent law that was passed prohibiting the import of people. Like you have to be a local to strip in Toronto.
Really? I was not aware of that.
They can't bring people from overseas, so it reduces the ability to exploit the people. And so now they turn it around and claiming, well, they're college students working their way through. We have the most intellectual strippers in Canada.
They're intellectual because they're local?
That's
really interesting.
I wonder about the article itself. I'm curious,
but is this a Sun?
It struck me as like you did say the Sun. Yeah, it struck me as it's like the Weekly World News of Canadian. Oh yeah, totally. I may follow closely behind them, but
That's a really interesting marketing tactic for Toronto. Thanks for the comment. Yes. You first and then Mike? Are you also Mike? Yeah, go ahead.
You said that there was legalization camp and decriminalization camp.
Right.
I'm wondering, because you talked about legalizing being placing specific regulations on the sex industry, but I'm wondering if you, let's say, decriminalize sex, prostitution, related stuff like that, could you still have safety legislation that was specific to that industry?
When you're getting into safety legislation that's specific to an industry, then you're getting into legalization. Again, that's tricky because then people who don't comply with specific legislation end up being criminalized or penalized. And I guess I'm wondering what specific safety legislation you would see as necessary. Are you talking about like safer sex practices and stuff like that, or testing practices?
I'm not sure at the moment. I just can't help but think that once you, if I more thoroughly reviewed this, that like the type of safety regulations you need for, let's say, retail workers at Staples would be different challenges than the types of safety hassles you face.
I have one thing. We have a working loan legislation that, and it all started with a girl in a donut shop who got murdered while she was working. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, all alone in a shop by herself. That's no, like in its basis thing, it's no different than what a sex worker may face, even in their own home if they were running a business out of their home.
Yeah, absolutely.
I kind of like legislations like that force somebody to be in a situation where they're being checked in on and protected.
Yeah, and I think there's broader legislation that covers multiple industries that are applicable to the sex industry and will provide at least good measures of safety for people involved in that industry. There may be an argument for sex industry specific regulation, but I'm not sure exactly the best approach to that or what people would be advocating for as far as specific regulation. Mike?
Having only a very simplistic understanding of trafficking, would you mind explaining more what that entails?
Trafficking can be like tricking people into moving to another country and then taking away their passport, or charging, pretending to be an immigration service and charging people extremely high fees to immigrate and then basically holding them in indentured servitude until their debts are paid off. Or even just transporting foreign workers over a border, even if they're doing it, somewhat willingly. So trafficking is a pretty broad issue, and it takes various forms. But basically, it's about moving people and isolating people. Does that answer your question?
Currently, the logical argument supports decriminalization. Science supports decriminalization of sex work. How are you going to bridge the logic gap? So you have people, so I'm not a parent. While intellectually I support these arguments that it should be decriminalized, I would have to take pause if I learned that one of my sons was involved in sex work. And even if I intellectualize it to say, well, let's say they're working in a sex-positive environment, it wasn't coercive, I still think, well, we live in a world where people think bad things about sex that takes place outside of missionary position. But regardless of society.
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear the last bit you were saying.
There are lots of bad jobs.
Like, I wouldn't want my kid to be a janitor because it's thought of as low status, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't allow people to be whatever they want.
My son being a janitor probably wouldn't keep him from getting another job in the future. Whereas working in sex work, it was known about. We see this now. Every so often you find out some person in a public field, be it a teacher, is found, maybe involved in a film, and they involved in sex trade, and they lose their jobs.
But if those are legal jobs, then to discriminate on hiring someone based on that might be against the law anyway.
It might not be, because as a private, you can decide, I'm not going to hire people who have your background. You can say that's part of your honor code.
Or you could just not be upfront. I mean, that happens.
Yeah, it is the case. Well, but you can't prove it most of the time. I worked at Domo, but it's not on my resume.
You should be ashamed of yourself.
How are, despite having logic on your side, you're going to have how can you bridge the gap between making the society more acceptable?
See, that's a really tough one, because you're looking at all sorts of different vectors of oppression and marginalization there. Where as you start to, as we get better on sexism, I think we're going to get better on sex negativity, and I think also as a society we start to dispense with these really puritanical religious views, there's less stigma around engaging in sex work. It's still very stigmatized, and that's a legitimate concern. But I mean, I also think it's one of those things that as a parent you can educate your children about how people are going to perceive you if you do X, Y, Z, right? So that when they're adults, they can make an informed choice. Really, this whole stigmatization is a big social issue that I don't think can be really addressed within the context of discussing decriminalization. But I think decriminalization is a big step towards reducing stigma, because it's suddenly a profession that's a legitimate career choice, not illegal.
I agree. But I have a question about how this affects the current feminist movement. I mean, we're looking at decreasing the objectivity of females, and for that matter, homosexuals, gays, lesbians, trans. If we're selling them as a commodity, legally,
a service they're providing them.
It could be a service, and then we'll have to talk about them paying GST. But
Worked in Rome.
I mean, is this something that is a positive thing for everything? All these movements that are really trying hard in tandem?
That's a really tricky question, because sex work is a really divisive issue in the feminist movement, or feminist movements. They're not a monolith at all. But sorry, brain blank. I don't think that sex work necessarily has to hurt any of these movements, because it's not a third party selling these people or commoditizing them. It's them making informed, consensual choices about what they do with their own bodies. And I think that encouraging people and allowing people to exercise their own agency and giving them the opportunity to consent to things that they want to do is empowering. And anything else, you're basically imposing another person's view on somebody, and I consider that to be very disempowering and like patriarchal and paternal.
I agree.
Oh, sorry, I've got to back first, and then you.
I think that speaks to the confusion people have between exploiting people, and which could happen in any industry. Like you mentioned, the garment industry, there's just as much, or at least a comparable amount of exploitation there, as compared to the idea of a person making a decision on their own to engage in sex for money is a far cry from somebody being forced or coerced into this position. And yet, in the public mind, they're together. They're interchangeable.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's like a lot of public perception that nobody could ever possibly choose this kind of work willingly when they had other options. But that's simply not true. And we really do have to separate people or the issues of people who are trafficked or coerced from those who do it willingly and consensually, because they're totally different groups with different needs and different issues.
I was just wondering if you have this talk anywhere on the web, or...
Not yet, but I can... Jem, can we put this stuff up somewhere after?
We'll make the videos available online, and we can also make the, if you have text of presentations, we'll publish those on WinnipegSkeptics.com.
Cool. Anyone else? Yeah.
I was wondering if you could comment on the number of countries that have chosen legalization versus decriminalization, and any studies that have looked at the benefits and negative aspects for the different groups. Presumably, under legalization, you have a group that is moved under a regulated environment, which might benefit, and then a group that's still marginalized and might actually be in a worse position potentially. I'm just wondering if there's any studies that comment on that.
I can't speak to how many countries have legalized or decriminalized prostitution. I don't have those numbers available right now. I don't know of any specific studies that make those comparisons, but there's lots of literature out there by sex worker rights advocates groups and sex workers themselves working under those different models with their criticisms and what they find beneficial, what they find troublesome. So there's plenty of material out there, but I'm not aware of it all having been condensed into a single study.